Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real pleasure of mine to welcome back to my show a gentleman that has been very involved in politics and public affairs over the course of the last decade or more. Kelly Harris, he's a principal with Harris Public Affairs. For the past decade, he's worked in senior positions with Canadian credit unions, including a director of the Canadian Credit Union Association Board of Directors. Prior to that, he was the director of the BC Government Communications Caucus and Public Information Officer with the BC Provincial Emergency Program. And since April 2020, he has been heading the COVID-19 response for a credit union in both Eastern Alberta and Northeastern Alberta, helping members of the credit union access government programs and helping the credit union navigate everything from stay-at-home orders to requirements of essential services like financial institutions. Kelly, welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. How are you doing, buddy?
Pretty good, Brian. Pretty good. Just got back from a rainy bike ride, but you know.
And where are you situated right now? In Calgary or Edmonton?
I'm in Calgary.
And how are you enjoying the change from downtown Toronto?
I miss Toronto terribly. I can't wait to get back. I grew up in Calgary, and it's a great place to be from.
But the two most important questions, I guess, are you still watching and rooting for the Toronto Maple Leafs? And number two, who's going to win?
Well, of course, I'm rooting for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I've rooted for them all my life, and I always say the Leafs are going to win, but we'll keep the faith. You see the number 34 jersey behind me there. I'm pretty sure.
Fantastic.
Yeah, you remember that game against Ottawa where he broke into the league, right?
I do.
And also, it's a good day to be in Calgary because this is the anniversary. Today is the anniversary of Lanny McDonald being the only visiting captain ever to hoist the cup in the Montreal Forum.
Really?
As
That's
captain in 1989, yeah.
So let's get off of hockey and get onto the pandemic. What took you to Alberta to be working with credit unions in regards to the pandemic?
Well, it's kind of interesting. When the pandemic hit, my former CEO out at First Ontario Credit Union, where I was the vice president of public and corporate affairs, he had just taken over a credit union in Northern Alberta that was very thin on senior executive leadership, and he was trying to make a lot of changes at the credit union. And he didn't really have the bench strength basically to be handling the response to a pandemic and all the various government programs. So he called me up, and it so happened that the minute the pandemic hit, I lost 3 of my contracts in Toronto, so I was free. And he just said, "Can you come out for 3 months?" Or 90 days. I call it my own personal Gilligan's Island, a 3-month tour that has turned into 16 months now almost. And so I hopped in my car at the start of the pandemic. I got a letter of transit from the credit union to say I was responding to an essential service, but we of course know that has never been required during a pandemic, which does not make any sense. And I drove across the country with my cat in the backseat of my car. Sadly, the cat's no longer with me or us, but I drove up to northeastern Alberta, and it was a good place to be because they had a grand total of 2 cases of COVID-19 in Bonnyville, Alberta at the time. So it wasn't too bad.
So your cat decided she wanted to remain an Easterner?
No. My cat passed away a couple weeks back.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. I was trying to make a joke that she wanted to stay in the East and she didn't appreciate the move to the West.
I think he did want to stay in the East, yes. But yeah.
So let's get everyone oriented. Where's Bonnyville?
Bonnyville is the area that the credit union is in. Most people would recognize the term Cold Lake a lot more than Bonnyville. Cold Lake, of course, is one of Canada's largest Air Force bases, and Canada's basically it protects the northern part of Canada. And was set up during the Cold War to protect the northern part of Canada. Bonnyville is about half hour, 45 minutes from south of Cold Lake, but it is about it's about a 2.5 hour northeast of Edmonton.
Okay.
So pretty far up there.
I actually know the area. My brother was a United Church minister in Cold Lake and had a 2-point charge, one in Cold Lake, and then he had to drive, I think it was like an hour east for his second charge, which was in northern Saskatchewan, and then back every Sunday.
Yeah, that's there's not a lot around there. I got to tell you, it's a small community, but I have to say, and very natural resource dependent community. So much of Alberta, the pandemic is if the pandemic is a black swan event, they were already going through a black swan event with what's going on in the oil industry. So there was a great need and necessity for government programs of many different kinds in this area, certainly to keep the lights on businesses, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing, and just basic supports for the community, that because of how hard it's been hit because of what's been going on with the oil industry.
So has the government done the right things? The word we hear here in Toronto is that Alberta is in really tough shape, that the premier relaxed things too quickly, that he had opposition from within his own caucus, and that this current wave is just devastating the provincial hospital system. What's the reality?
Well, the reality is we are down. We had our lowest number of cases since March, and that was on the weekend. The thing that people don't quite understand about Alberta is, especially the hardest hit areas for this now third wave of the pandemic, it's hitting northern Alberta because of the work camps. The oil industry, oil and gas industry, already hit hard enough by the low, a year ago we had the Russia OPEC cabal going on, driving down oil prices and everything else that's happened to the oil industry. But if you think about work camps, you're talking about basically bunks where multiple people are sleeping in the same basically trailer.
Right.
At a work camp. You get one person with COVID and everybody's going to get COVID. We went through that.
People that were migrant farm workers last summer in Ontario, and COVID was rampant in agricultural southwestern Ontario. So I can understand exactly what you're saying.
And the other one in Alberta is the meat packing plants. They were significantly hit. The Brooks area, just south of Calgary, near High River, there's another massive meat packing plant. And again, these are migrant. Many times these are lower income people, because we're not talking about highly skilled labor, at least in the meatpacking or in the produce industry and such like that in the Essex County area. We're talking about people who need jobs, but oftentimes they're the hardest hit. I mean, pandemics hit, any disease tends to hit the lower end of the socioeconomic scale harder than any other portion of the economic scale.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that.
And we've certainly seen that. So in Calgary, we've got the northeastern part of Calgary has been particularly hit. The northeastern part of Calgary it's a large immigrant area of the city, but also, Brian, a lot of people don't actually understand this, and I've been talking about this with the people up in Bonnyville, especially because I used to travel back and forth, but with the wave hitting, I'm not about to stay in hotels that oil workers are staying in, yeah, as you can imagine. But one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is the people who work in northern Alberta, many of the oil workers, they're coming out of Ontario. They're flying into Ontario. So when the UK variant started exploding in Ontario, these are the same guys. They were hopping on planes, coming to Alberta, bringing the UK variant to Alberta, and then all of a sudden it started spreading and exploding in Alberta. So I guess that's I guess that's what Ontario does for Alberta for all those transfer payments over the years.
Oh, we're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris. He's a political affairs expert, a political junkie, a very smart guy. He's got experience in emergency responses previously. We're going to focus in on some of his experiences on emergency responses after a break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris. He's a principal of Harris Public Affairs, and he's worked in senior positions for the last decade with Canadian credit unions. And he's now working with a Canadian credit union in Alberta dealing with COVID-19. And Kelly, what you're saying is that emergency response is sort of something that you've been experienced with in the past. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when I first started working with the British Columbia government back in the early 2000s, they have British Columbia. They call it the province of emergencies. They have several wildfires, ice jams, two emergencies too numerous to count. So they have done something through their provincial emergency program called TEAMS, and what TEAMS is temporary emergency assignment management system. So when an emergency happens, you have the leadership at the provincial emergency program, and they run the response to an emergency, but then they take people from various business units in the government, and they go in and they create the team to respond to the emergency. And as such, I was with the Attorney General and Solicitor General's office at the time, and I was designated as a public information officer for the province of British Columbia. Had to go through significant amounts of training to do this. We were routinely sent for week-long training at the various different PREOCs, which is the provincial emergency centers around the province, to learn everything about emergency response. And as a public information officer, it wasn't just how to deal with the media. You actually had to learn about the reasons for why we do certain things in the response so that you can best translate that to the media when they're asking questions. And it just so happens my first response was I was the public information officer responding to the avian flu crisis in 2004. Yes.
That would have been interesting.
It was interesting. I was on the ground in Abbotsford, BC for about 3 months, and it was a joint effort between the province and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the province of BC and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And the problem was when early on in the crisis, the minister, the federal minister, announced the destruction of 19 million chickens, basically, in the Fraser Valley to deal with the avian flu crisis, which had then spread to 2 people as well. And the feds basically pulled out all of their communications people. So they had no communications people. And my boss, it's kind of a funny story. My boss said to me, he said, we need somebody to run the press conference today. I said, yeah. And he says, have you ever done a press conference before, Kelly? And I said, oh yeah, I've done tons of them. So there I am. And the press conference was at the Agricultural Center in Abbotsford. I always remember there was about 40 reporters, 6 live cameras. We had a panel of the health experts and various jurisdictional people on the table, and there I am running the press conference. And afterwards, I said to my boss, the head of media relations for the BC government at the time, Kelly Gleason, I think he's still there actually. I said to him, how do you think I did? He says, well, you're an old pro at this. I said, yeah, I've attended a lot of them. That was the first time I've ever run one. So he wasn't very happy with me, but it went off well, and I kept doing them. So I guess he got over it. So it was pretty good.
Remind us a little bit about avian flu. Tell us what happened.
So basically, this was something that spread from Asia as well, and it attacked the poultry population in British Columbia. Poultry industry in the Lower Mainland is about a $4 to $6 billion industry a year. So you can imagine that has a major impact on a province the size of BC. It would be like the auto industry getting shut down completely in Ontario. Manufacturing, I guess, would be
really. Never would have thought it was that big. That's amazing.
It's quite big. There's not a lot of industry in the Lower Mainland other than farming, really, because of the agricultural land reserve and what you can actually do down there. So what had happened is they had noticed birds that were not acting like they should. They weren't being able to stand up. They were falling over. There was various issues with this, and they tested them, and they found the avian flu that had been hitting China for quite a while had now spread to British Columbia. And the problem is farming community in the Lower Mainland, and I'm sure in various areas of Ontario it's the same, they're cooperatives. Much like credit unions are cooperatives, but their farming communities are cooperatives. And so they share a lot of things. And one of the things they do is they share equipment because it cuts down on the overall cost.
And so once it gets one spot, it spreads.
Yeah. And then that was the thing we couldn't figure out because there was no rhyme nor reason to the tracing of where the avian flu was hitting, and it kept popping up in different areas. And we couldn't figure it out until we brought in some farming experts, and using my old journalism skills from being a reporter back in the day, I actually started interviewing farming guys. And I remember saying this to the people, this is clearly how it's spreading. And it was quite a long drawn out response. I remember showing up early to mid-March in Abbotsford, and I didn't get home until early June. All the while I got home to a very annoyed fiance who I had left to plan the entire wedding that was happening in July that year. But it got me out of that at least. But what it taught me is I learned a lot of very important lessons on emergency management.
Like what?
One, get big quick. Don't be cheap. If it's a big enough emergency that you're going to have an emergency response, don't go on the cheap. You need to get out there. You need to get every resource you can, every resource imaginable, because it's a lot easier to pare down than it is to build up. So that's the first thing that you need to do. The second thing you need to do is get all the decision makers in the same room. Everybody in the same room. It needs to be co-located decision making so that everybody has an opportunity to raise their issues. And then you appoint a lead, and the lead listens to all of the issues being raised and then makes a decision. And that includes, especially with avian flu, and I'm sure happening at pandemic tables across the country, that includes the health experts. And the health experts are experts on health. They're not experts on communications. They're not experts on the economy. They're not experts on anything other than health. And so you have to basically weigh every decision that's made. You have to understand that not everybody putting in their 2 cents has the full spectrum and the whole. Not everybody's going to have a fulsome look at the issue. That's why you need to designate somebody in charge.
So let's talk about that for a second. I had an emergency preparedness expert on my show, and he said that we're asking public health people to make decisions they were never trained for. And he said that when Doug Ford, Premier Doug Ford of Ontario, said no one's going to disagree with his top health expert because politically it would be a disaster. He said that's exactly what you've got to have emergency preparedness and or politicians do, which is they've got to at times potentially overrule the health experts and take into account other issues. What do you think of that?
Well, here's a question for you, Brian. What province have we seen a emergency preparedness person or provincial emergency program person stand up and talk about the emergency, the pandemic? Where have we seen it? Have we seen it in Ottawa? Have we seen it at Queen's Park? We haven't seen that.
How come?
Because the way it's being responded to is being responded to by politicians. And I'm not saying that every decision they make is politically driven, but if you look at some of the decisions and you don't think there's some politics going on, I don't think anybody could possibly say that there's no politics been going on.
Is it just because the politicians want the soapbox?
I honestly think, and yeah, I do beat him up a little bit in my writing, but I honestly think it's because the Prime Minister started out speaking in public, and after a couple of those, he needed to turn that over to the experts, the emergency preparedness experts. the people who actually do this kind of work for a living. But because he stayed up talking all the time, all the provincial leaders and municipal leaders followed suit. Because and now we see it, Doug Ford actually is at home because he might have COVID and terrified, and he's getting beat up in the media because he's not making statements every day. The guy's done about 250 press conferences, but he misses, 5 days in a row, and they're tearing him apart and saying, how come he's allowed to take a day off work?
In past emergencies, have the politicians similarly taken the lead in communications and the decision making, or have we left it to emergency preparedness people?
The politicians are obviously always told. I think back to the 2004 Okanagan Lake fires in BC that took down basically the entire Okanagan Mountain and threatened the city of Kelowna, which is considerable. I mean, we're talking a pretty big place. And yes, the Prime Minister did tour. Prime Minister Chrétien toured. Premier Campbell toured the area. But they weren't standing up every single day and justifying every single decision. They left that to the experts. And I think if there's one thing that we can say, who's the expert in the let's say Trudeau cabinet? Who's the expert? Well, it's supposed to be Bill Blair. Okay, I'm actually not sure leaving it up to him would have been a good idea, just listening to him talk. But again, the politicians are there to give people calm. But what other thing could be happening where we just leave it to the top politician, everything? If we're talking about schools closing, is the premier standing up every single day talking about schools? We're talking about hospital issues. Is the premier getting up and talking about hospitals every single day? This is an emergency, and the only people we're hearing from are politicians
and public health.
But nobody who is involved in emergency management, emergency preparedness, and emergency
who are trained for this. And
yes.
The gentleman I have on my show once in a while has got a master's in emergency preparedness, and he's saying no one's listening to the emergency preparedness experts.
Yeah, exactly. The emergency preparedness, and this is why I say there's politics involved. An emergency preparedness expert would have seen.
Is that why taking vaccines or not taking vaccines and masks and other things are becoming so partisan political?
Yeah. Again, but think about this one, Brett. If you're an emergency preparedness expert and you know that there are variants blowing up all over the world, like the UK variant, like the Brazilian variant, like the Indian variant, the South African variant, would you let planes from those areas come into your country?
No, it's interesting. Taiwan and Singapore just reported, who everyone thought were doing a spectacular job, have had waves come back. And it's all because of flight crews that have flown in. And in Taiwan's case, it's kind of strange. The flight crews went to the tea houses, which are, pseudonyms for male entertainment or adult entertainment. And it became a super spreader event. Mm-hmm. And Taiwan's closing down Taipei again.
Yeah, exactly. So emergency preparedness people would look at shutting down provincial borders. They would have looked at shutting down all air travel coming into the country. They would have looked at making sure that if you send your kids back to school, that they had rapid testing in the schools. Like that to me is one of the worst decisions made, and it was made across the country.
So is one of the lessons that you've learned from your involvement in emergencies that politicians want to make the decisions and they're not qualified to do so, and therefore they should not be making those decisions and they shouldn't be communicating every day?
Well, no, I think that I think at the start of the pandemic, yes, there was a need for them to stand up and talk and calm fears and everything like that. When there's a significant announcement to be made, the politicians should be the ones making it, because that is why they're elected. But the person that they should be getting a lot of direction from needs to be people in emergency management. And I just don't. If that's happening, there's no evidence of it. with some of the decisions that are being made. The allowance for people to be moving about as they are, the allowance for people to be flying into our country the way that it is, the lack of emergency testing, the lack of PPEs even at the start of the epidemic, the entire just a terrible performance on getting vaccines for our country. None of this was done clearly with a sight line to actually responding to the emergency. It feels like emergency management by issues management. And I've been saying that on the radio and in print for quite some time, Brian. And that would be what I would say. It feels like emergency management by issues management.
We're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris. He's a public affairs expert, turns out an emergency preparedness expert as well. Someone who's working with credit unions in Alberta dealing with the pandemic and has worked previously for the province of British Columbia in regards to avian flu. And he's had a lot of other experiences in Indigenous relations, et cetera. We're going to take a break and come back with Kelly. He's got some very strong words for the province of Ontario and the provincial progressive conservative government and Premier Doug Ford. And he's written an article, a column recently, and I'm going to ask him about that. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris. He's a friend of mine who I really have a lot of time for. He's got some very frank points of view. And even though he is a long-term conservative, when he thinks that there's decisions being made that are wrong, he calls them out. And he's written a fascinating column recently that I've got to reference in the Niagara Independent. And you said that Doug Ford, Premier Doug Ford of Ontario, has lost the room. And I'd like to know what you mean by that. I also want to quote one paragraph, if I could. It's saying, having people turn off because you are not making any sense is the death knell for a government. It illustrates a government that is out of touch, a government that is only listening to who they want to listen to, and a government that doesn't represent the me in a voter's mind. What do you mean by all that, Kelly?
Well, it's quite apparent. I talk to people from Ontario all the time. And the number of senior conservative thinkers in Ontario who are quite concerned about what is going on at Queen's Park right now, it's staggering. The numbers are still decent, but let's be honest, the numbers are decent because it's like something that a columnist from the Vancouver Sun wrote a long time ago, Vaughn Palmer, and I quite like Vaughn Palmer, and he said this about the government I worked for. He said the BC Liberals don't need to be perfect, they just need to be better than the NDP. And right now, it seems like the Conservatives at Queen's Park are taking that same tact. We don't need to be perfect, we just need to be better than the NDP and Liberals. And because the NDP have a leader that, all she does is lose elections, and the Liberals' new leader, he's not well known, and even if he was better known, I don't know that he would relate well to people. So the Conservatives have that going for them. However, some of the things that are coming out of their mouths are being disproven almost immediately by the actions that are happening in the province. Say, for example, we had the doctor saying people need to get outside, and the premier saying, no, you can't go golfing, and all these other things. And then they allow something like active TO to take place, where thousands of people are on their bicycles and walking down the lakeshore, and the potential for super spreader events just from that. This is at the same time the premier is saying we're not going to open up golf courses. When your words and your actions don't match in government, you lose the room. And let's be honest, that happened quite distinctly to Kathleen Wynne. That's why she's no longer the premier.
What do you mean lose the room?
people aren't turning you off. People aren't listening to you anymore. People are not trusting you have their best intentions in mind when you're making decisions. And that, if you think back to the start of the pandemic, when everybody was like, oh God, we're going to do a pandemic with Doug Ford, there was that large sentiment in Ontario. But then he proved his genuineness, which I really do believe he did. His numbers went skyrocketing, where he talked like Doug Ford talks, when he just said what he thinks, said what's on his mind. And we all remember him saying, the words he had for Donald Trump about the masks and opening borders. And we were all applauding him. Liberals were applauding him openly. Liberal friends of mine were texting me saying, I didn't see this in Doug Ford, but you always said he had it. I just never saw it. And then you go to the press conference, what was it, last week, where he talked about his reopening plan, which was the most confusing reopening plan I've ever heard in my life. And he sounds robotic. It's like they're trying to turn Doug Ford into a professional politician. And there is zero about this man that is a professional politician. And I do think there's a reason for it. And if you want to, I'll tell you about it. It's what we used to call in media, when I worked in newspapers, we called it beat syndrome.
Beat syndrome. What's beat syndrome?
Beat syndrome is you've spent too much time working on the same beat. Like, say you're a health reporter, okay? I'll use health reporter because we're talking about pandemic. You might write the most exquisite columns, perfectly grammatical, all the wonderful words, perfectly accurate in every way about the healthcare industry. But all you ever do is write about healthcare. So when people read your column, they're like, I don't understand a single thing this person just said. Well, that happens when you have people working in communications and they spend too much time working on a single issue. This is something that we learned in the Provincial Emergency Program BC. You need to rotate your communications people. You need to get them out of the spotlight. You need to get their heads onto something else every once in a while.
So Doug Ford's becoming a professional politician because he spent too much time doing these press conferences on COVID.
That and his staff, like they need to be rotating people through the communications team at the Premier's office. They need to be sending those guys, say, you need to take a couple of weeks off. You need to go sit at home and not read the newspaper. You just need to get away from this stuff. And bring in, and like I said earlier, get big quick. Bring in communications experts who can have a new focus on what you're doing and what you're talking to each other about. Brian, we could have, if you and I sat down and had the same conversation for, I don't know, 3 weeks, we could determine about one thing. Okay, we want to fix a problem. You and I, we fix that problem, and only you and I talk about it. And then we go try and tell other people about what we talked about. They won't understand us. That is what's going on right now, what I feel that's going on in the Premier's office right now. And a stark example of that was when they did the reopening plan, and they were talking about 60% of the province needs to be vaccinated, right? We all know this, okay? And then they go to Dr. David Williams, and he says, yeah, 60, and they ask him, so we can reopen after 60% gets vaccinated. And he says, oh yeah, but you got to wait 2 weeks after that because it has to kick in. And they pan to the Premier, and the look on the Premier's face was like, what did he just say?
Holy moly.
It's like, everybody knows that in the room, that it's going to take 2 weeks after 60%, but they don't calculate it into their delivery of the communications in the reopening plan, because why would they? They all know it, because they've only been focused on the pandemic. They need new blood in the Premier's office to help them with their communications.
But it's not just communications, is it? They've just been making some bad decisions, haven't they? Like the not opening the golf courses, we already talked about. But It seems like they opened up too quickly and then they closed down too slowly. They've just responded. The opening, the closing down was done with no notice, and so I had restaurateurs all over the place saying, if they had given me a couple of hours notice, a couple of days notice, I wouldn't have bought so much food for the weekend. And they closed us down right before the weekend rush. I had staff that was already hired. I had to pay them and then send them home after 4 hours. Like it was as if they were trying to really do a really bad job, and they accomplished it.
Well, Brian, I was talking to my nephew on New Year's Eve, and I said, and he has a restaurant out in Kelowna, and I said, you're going to have a big night? And he's like, no, they told me yesterday that I can only stay open till 8.
On New Year's Eve?
On January 30th, the BC government told restaurants that they could only stay open till 8 on January 31st. Doug Ford is not the only one making these mistakes. And the reason is honestly, I do not see any evidence that professional emergency response people are working in any of the governments across the country.
I don't see it either. And I also don't think they're making decisions from a practical reality of how people run businesses.
Well, exactly. So you've got
many of them are, maybe other than Doug Ford, many of them are professional politicians and have never run businesses.
Well, what kind of surprises me, because you think about the jobs minister, Vic Fideli, economic development minister. I mean, he made his millions running a business. And you take a look at the small business minister as well, and I'm going to butcher his name if I say it, so I'm just going to his deputy, basically his small business minister. I'm wondering, like, I keep seeing them showing up at these things with like the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and stuff like that, but are they touring the businesses, like say along Queen Street in Toronto, which are all now for lease? Are they talking to the people who own a ton of restaurants in Toronto and saying, okay, when we give notice to shut down, what's a good way to do that? Like, are they talking to the small businesses and getting their advice? Is Dan Kelly from CFIB, Canadian Federation of Independent Business?
I just don't understand why massage is okay, but a haircut's not, a hairdresser's not. And, there are like inspectors that make sure that the hair salons, et cetera, adhere to certain cleanliness standards. But
Brian, this is one of the things about the communications that I'm talking about. I can tell you why massage is okay, but hairstylist is not. Because if you shut down massage, you then affect the healthcare system, because registered massage therapists actually provide a healthcare service. So you can't shut down massage, because then you would shut down healthcare. It's like bike riding. I had somebody send me a response to one of my editorials when I was actually defending the premier on shutting down golf courses, actually. But responding says, you ride your bike all the time. Why is that legal, but golfing is not? It's like, well, if you live in downtown Toronto, you're getting your food delivered by some guy on a bike. If you shut down biking, how are people going to get their food delivered? Same thing with veterinarians. Why veterinarians never got shut down? Because they provide services to farms, and that's part of the supply chain. All of these things could be explained if you had somebody just stand up and explain it. But you yourself, you just said, well, massage versus haircutting. But you understand that because massage is part of the healthcare sector.
Yeah, but look how long my hair's getting. It's not good.
You and me both. Hey, man, you know what? I know several of my friends who've gone full Messier, just shaved it all off. So we're up on them. So don't worry about that.
Kelly, didn't you work with Tim Hudak? Weren't you like one of the key Tories at one point in time? What gives? How can you be so negative toward what Ford is doing?
Well, yeah, I was director of legislative affairs for the Hudak opposition. Actually, the Scrap the Green Energy Act? I wrote the original version of it, believe it or not. Here's the thing. I know that the 2022 election is going to be one of the most important in Ontario history. And it is clear that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be cleaned up in the province of Ontario. And I don't trust Stephen Del Duca to do it, because he was part of the cabal that made the problems in Ontario. So sitting back and watching the party that I support, that I hope gets reelected, make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, what kind of friend would I be if I just sat back and let it happen?
Would have been better if Patrick Brown had stayed in as leader?
It'd be better if Patrick Brown had done a few things, but or not done a few things, or let's be honest, that never proven. But I think what Patrick went through makes him a better mayor, and because he's had that experience, he would be a better leader and premier. I don't think Doug Ford's a bad premier. I believe he's getting bad advice.
We're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris, political junkie, activist, public affairs expert, emergency preparedness, communications expert, about pandemics, about Alberta, about credit unions, about avian flu, about COVID-19, and about how this Tim Hudak guy is now criticizing Premier Doug Ford. It's kind of interesting. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Kelly Harris. He's a public affairs expert. He's working out in Alberta right now with a credit union. He's worked in BC as a communications expert, emergency preparedness communications expert. He's worked in the Tim Hudak opposition as a, legislative affairs specialist, director of, and he's a smart guy, and he's actually got a ton of experience in Aboriginal affairs, and I'd love to chat with him about that at some point in time as well. Kelly, what sort of, actually, before I get to lessons learned, you've criticized Doug Ford. What about your premier, Jason Kenney? He's come into a lot of criticism, and it's almost as if there's a caucus revolt and we're going to have the Wild Rose Party back. What's going on?
Well, Alberta has two cities. Okay, they have two 1.1 or 1.2 million cities, and everywhere else in Alberta is small town. And I always joke, when I used to drive down to Windsor to get produce when I lived in Toronto, people would say, "You're driving all the way that for produce? It's 3 hours." And I said, "Yeah, it's Alberta. It's 3 hours to the next town." It's very small populations, very widespread. And I guarantee you go to small towns in Ontario and you talk to people about their impressions on avian flu, they're going to tell, COVID-19, they're going to tell you it's not a big deal. You're going to hear that. You're going to hear that.
In Elora that I talked to that say, there's been one person in the whole county.
So now you've got an entire province, with the exception of a couple of centers, population centers, that is represented by those very people. So when you're shutting down the province and businesses are failing and people are struggling, especially after being hit with all the difficulties with the oil industry, you're going to get stiffer reactions. It won't be just one Roman Baber, it'll be half a caucus of Roman Babers. And that is what Jason Kenney is battling with. Because it's not that they're COVID deniers, they just don't see it as a problem because it's not a problem where they are. I guarantee you, downtown Calgary, none of the people from downtown Calgary have the same impressions. You're not going to hear that from people from cities. They're going to have a different appreciation when the COVID-19 is very.
So Jason Kenney's going to survive.
I believe he will.
The Conservative Party will not splinter.
I don't think so. I think that when they actually think about it, Rachel Notley's still a real threat out here. And nobody wants to go back to NDP governments in Alberta.
Okay. What about the federal government? We only got a couple minutes left. What do you think about Justin Trudeau versus Aaron O'Toole? People are thinking it might be this fall.
I think it probably will be this fall, but I honestly, it all hinges on vaccinations, because we're seeing the more that the issues with vaccinations happen, and as we see the rest of the world opening up and Canada's still waiting, Justin Trudeau's numbers are falling, and that's what it's going to hinge on.
But as of this past weekend, Canada on a per capita basis is doing as well with first vaccinations as the United States. And within 2 weeks, we'll be ahead of the United States. And we don't have, all these Republican states where people are anti-vaxxers. So we could actually soon be doing far better than the United States in vaccinations.
Not second vaccinations, though. We're not going to get second vaccinations. The first 1 dose summer, 2 dose fall. Fall ends on the 21st of December.
Yeah, but the first vaccination is what keeps you out of the hospital for sure.
Not against the UK variant. It's been proven that the UK variants, the variants have a fight. You can still, very good chance you're going to get it with the variants with only one vaccination.
Okay, so what do you think is going to happen in the fall then, if we have an election?
It depends on how people are feeling over the summer. What I'm seeing is, the more the world opens up and the more Canada stays closed, the harder it will be for anybody to repeat, to be reelected. And that I truly believe. I believe that Aaron O'Toole could win if that's the case. I just like the longer Ontario stays closed, the harder it's going to be for Doug Ford to win next year. That's how I see it. It was one thing with the other elections we've seen, like the BC election stuff, where everybody in Canada but everybody in the world was also closed down. That's not the election math that's going on right now. People are looking around the world. They're seeing people in sports stadiums. They're seeing concerts. They're seeing all these things, and they're saying, "Why not me?" And once again, when I said lost the room, does the government represent me? And if the United States is open and Canada's not, the government will not, people will say that government does not have my back.
Well, I think that there's a chance, and if vaccinations actually work, and if COVID-19 is actually real, and both of those I happen to believe, I think you're going to see another wave in the United States in Republican states. And logically, you should. If your vaccination rate in typical Republican states is less than 35%, and the vaccination rate is over 75% in Democratic states, at some point in time, you should see a difference in infections and mortality. And it should happen. And if it doesn't, then we shouldn't have to get the vaccine. And so, it's kind of interesting. And so I think there's a very good chance that by it going down naturally in the summertime, that what the wave that we're cresting and coming down naturally on now, with dramatic increases in first vaccinations, if not second vaccinations, I think that we could be looking really good in the fall relative to the United States.
I think that's the fall relative to the United States, and potentially, but it's not just the United States we compare ourselves to. And I don't know about you, but I'm a huge football fan, soccer football fan, and I'm already seeing fans going back to the games in the UK and other places. Canadians are going to look around the world and say, why is everybody else?
You think about the UK. The UK has been a success because of vaccinations with AstraZeneca.
Yeah, the one that I took, and I can't wait.
Now closed down.
Well, no, we haven't. We're going to use what we have.
Yeah.
But
so I was lucky enough to get AstraZeneca first shot. I'll get the second shot, but lots of other people won't.
Brian, I'll tell you this right now. I believe that is politically motivated too, because all the AstraZeneca were being redirected to India to deal with the crisis that's going on there. And it just feels too convenient to me that when we all of a sudden all the AstraZeneca stuff is being sent to India, and Canada's not going to get any, and then all of a sudden we stand up and say, oh no, we're not using AstraZeneca anymore. But doesn't that feel convenient? Like, why is it good enough to vaccinate in the worst hit area in the world? That AstraZeneca is good enough to send to there and vaccinate in India, but it's not good enough for us. Come
well, we
on.
couldn't take the risk of the one blood clot. Kelly Harris, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your points of view. Really appreciate it. If people want to check you out, you've got a weekly radio show?
Every Tuesday, I'm on the Alex Pearson Show on Global Radio in Toronto, and my columns appear in the Niagara Independent Weekly.
Look forward to having you check back in with me in the future. Thanks so much.
For sure, Brian.
Thank you. Well, that's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.